He was the man who fixed the boiler. That was how most people at Hartwell and Associates knew him. Not by name, not by face, really, just by the function. The boiler guy. The one who showed up when the heat went out on the 4th floor, who left before anyone thought to thank him, whose work boots left faint scuff marks on the marble near the service elevator that the cleaning crew wiped away each morning without a second thought. His name was Bernard Colquhoun. He was 51 years old. He had worked as a facilities technician for the building management company that contracted with Hartwell for 11 years. He drove a 2009 Ford F-150 with a cracked left side mirror that he'd been meaning to replace since October. He packed his lunch most days, a thermos of coffee, a sandwich his daughter Ivy had started making for him on Sunday nights and portioning into bags for the week. He ate alone in the basement break room, next to the utility sink, reading whatever paperback he'd picked up from the library donation bin by the front desk. Nobody at Hartwell knew any of that. They knew the boiler. The annual holiday party at Hartwell and Associates had been held at the same venue for 6 years running. The Marquette Room on the top floor of their own building, rented back from the building management company at a rate that would have made Bernard quietly raise an eyebrow if he'd ever seen the invoice. He had, actually. It was one of the files that crossed his supervisor's desk. He'd seen the number, said nothing, and gone back to checking the water pressure gauges in the mechanical room 2 floors below. He hadn't planned to go. He was scheduled to be on call that evening for the building systems. Someone had to be. The Marquette Room needed its own climate control adjusted. The freight elevator had to be unlocked for the caterer, and the event lighting in the lobby ran off a panel that required a maintenance code to access. His supervisor, a man named Don Veach, who managed 4 buildings and communicated primarily through 2-word texts, had asked Bernard to stay available. Not at the party, just available. There was a difference, Don had explained, though he hadn't elaborated on what it was. Bernard had been there since 4 in the afternoon. He'd adjusted the thermostat in the Marquette Room twice before anyone arrived, once because it was set too warm, and once because an event coordinator named Tricia, he'd caught her name from the lanyard she wore, had asked him to bump it up again after she'd been standing near the windows for 20 minutes. He'd fixed a loose bracket on the portable bar setup. He'd reset the circuit that controlled half the ambient lighting after someone from the catering company plugged a heat lamp into the wrong outlet. He'd done all of this without being asked twice, without complaint, without making it a thing. By 7 o'clock, the room was full. Bernard had positioned himself near the service corridor doorway. Not inside exactly, not outside either. In the threshold, technically, which was, in his experience, the best place to be when you needed to watch a room without being seen in it. He had a radio clipped to his belt and a half-empty thermos in his left hand. The party had the particular energy of a company event where attendance was optional, but absence was noted. People held drinks with both hands. Laughter came in short, practiced bursts. He recognized some of the faces. You learned people's faces in 11 years, even if they didn't learn yours. He knew the managing partner, a compact, silver-haired man named Jeffrey Adair, who always nodded at Bernard when they shared the elevator, and always seemed mildly surprised to see him there, as though he kept forgetting the building had maintenance staff. He knew the receptionist on the 3rd floor, a young woman with red glasses who always propped the stairwell door open with a rubber wedge and always looked sheepish when Bernard had to remind her that it was a fire door. He knew the junior associate who smoked on the loading dock every afternoon at 3:15 and who had once, during a particularly cold February, quietly moved out of Bernard's way when he'd needed to reach a valve behind the dumpsters, and who had said thank you in a way that suggested he actually meant it. Most of the rest were strangers with lanyards and open bars. He was on his second check of the thermostat. It had drifted again. It always drifted in a full room. Bodies generated more heat than people remembered when he heard the voice. Not speaking. Singing. Someone had gotten to the karaoke setup. The Marquette Room had a sound system that the events team used for background music, and apparently someone in the planning committee had thought karaoke would be a good idea, which, in Bernard's experience, was an idea that always sounded better at the planning stage than it looked in execution. The monitor was set up near the windows. A woman in a green dress was finishing something that had probably been total eclipse of the heart, and was receiving the kind of applause that is indistinguishable from relief. Then came the announcement. It came from a man standing near the bar, tall, loud in the way that people are loud when they've had exactly enough to feel unaccountable, whose name, Bernard would later learn, was Spencer Okafor. Spencer was a senior associate at Hartwell, the kind of person who called the building our building and meant it as an expression of belonging rather than accuracy. "Who's next?" Spencer said, in the voice of a man who had decided the evening needed direction. He looked around the room with the theatrical pleasure of someone who is about to make a suggestion that will embarrass someone else. His eyes moved past the circle of junior associates, past the paralegals clustered near the food table, and landed, with the particular instinct of someone who can always find the most vulnerable point in a room, on Bernard. Bernard was still standing in the service doorway. He had his thermos. He had his radio. He had the specific physical arrangement of someone who is present without participating, which should have been sufficient to communicate that he was working, not attending. He was wearing his navy work shirt with the building management logo on the chest pocket. His name was embroidered above the logo in white thread. It was not a costume that invited social engagement. Spencer pointed at him anyway. "What about the maintenance guy?" A few heads turned. Bernard looked up from the thermostat panel. He met Spencer's eyes across the room with the expression of a man who had encountered this particular kind of social physics before, and had long ago stopped finding it surprising. "I'm good," Bernard said. "Come on," Spencer said, already smiling in the direction of the people nearest to him, already building the scaffolding of the moment. "Don't be shy, it's a party." "I'm working," Bernard said. "The building's still standing," Spencer said, and a few people laughed. The short, reflexive laugh of people who aren't sure they should be laughing, but have decided to let someone else make that determination first. Bernard looked at him for a moment. He looked at the room. He looked at the microphone sitting in its stand by the karaoke monitor, and at the song list printed on the laminated card beside it, and at the 40 or 50 people in this room who had never once, in 11 years, thought to ask him his name. He set his thermos down on the ledge beside the panel. He walked across the room. The laughter increased slightly as he moved, not because anyone was laughing at something specific, but because movement, in this context, was itself a kind of joke, and Spencer had framed it as one, and the room had decided to agree. Someone near the bar said something Bernard didn't catch. There was the sound of a phone being raised. Someone filming, probably, the way people filmed anything that looked like it might become embarrassing. Bernard picked up the microphone. He looked at the song list for approximately 4 seconds. He turned to the sound system operator, a young man hired for the evening who was watching Bernard with the polite uncertainty of someone who wasn't sure if this was supposed to be happening, and said, quietly, the name of a song. The young man found it, cued it. The intro began. It was a Gordon Lightfoot song, The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. 6 minutes and 30 seconds of Canadian maritime tragedy, slow and particular, and not at all what anyone in that room had been expecting. Spencer Okafor made a small sound that was almost a laugh and then wasn't. And then Bernard Colhoun began to sing. The voice that came out of him was not a karaoke voice. It was not the voice of a man performing at a party or trying to be impressive or aware of the people watching him. It was a voice that had no interest in the room's opinion of it. It was a baritone, deep and even, with the kind of control that doesn't come from wanting to sound good, but from having spent years simply singing, in a truck cab on a highway at 6 in the morning, in a kitchen on a Sunday, in a church basement on a Wednesday night, when the attendance was thin and the piano was slightly out of tune. And it didn't matter because you were there for the music and not for the audience. Bernard had been singing in the choir at St. Andrew's United Church since he was 9 years old. Nobody at Hartwell and Associates knew that. The room, which had been processing this as comedy, recalibrated. It happened slowly, the way the mood of a room always shifts when reality contradicts expectation. Not all at once, but in stages, person by person, as each individual reached the same conclusion through slightly different evidence and slightly different timing. The woman in the green dress stopped talking to the man beside her. The junior associates near the food table turned to look. Spencer Okafor, who had been leaning against the bar with his drink raised and his mouth already shaped around whatever he was planning to say next, went quiet in a way that was visible from across the room. Bernard wasn't performing. He was just singing. He had his eyes on the middle distance, not on the screen, because he didn't need the screen. He knew this song the way you know something you've carried for a long time, not consciously, not as an exercise, but in the body, in the chest, in the particular quality of breath that makes the difference between someone singing at music and someone singing through it. His voice filled the Marquette room in a way that the room's acoustics, which had been designed for presentations and not for this, couldn't entirely contain. It moved past the catering table and through the ambient noise of ice in glasses and found the far windows and came back. 40 people stood and said nothing. Jeffrey Adair, the managing partner, set down his drink. The young woman with the red glasses, she was here, Bernard noticed, toward the back of the room, had her hand pressed flat against her sternum, the way people do when something catches them in a place they weren't expecting. Spencer Okafor had moved back slightly from the bar. Bernard sang the whole song, all 6 minutes and 30 seconds of it, the ship and the lake and the gales of November and the weight of something that doesn't come back. When it ended, the final note did not trail off or fade in the way that karaoke notes tend to. It resolved clearly with intention, and then it was simply finished. And Bernard lowered the microphone and placed it back in the stand with the same matter-of-fact efficiency with which he'd placed his thermos on the ledge. The room was quiet for a moment that was longer than politeness required. Then someone started clapping. Not Spencer. It was the young man behind the sound system, actually, who started it. Then the woman in the green dress. Then Jeffrey Adair, and then the rest. And by the time Bernard had turned to walk back toward the service doorway, the applause in the Marquette room was the kind that happens when a room full of people is trying to make up for something they haven't named yet. He picked up his thermos. He checked the thermostat. It had drifted again. He adjusted it. His daughter Ivy was awake when he got home. She was 23 and lived with him still. Not because she had nowhere to go. She had a job. She had friends. She'd had an apartment for 8 months before her mother got sick, and then she'd come home. And somehow the 8 months had stretched into 3 years. But because Hartwell Square was a 2-bedroom house, and the second bedroom was hers, and neither of them had found a reason to change that arrangement. Bernard's wife Louise had died 2 years ago in March. Kidney failure, fast and then slow and then fast again, the way those things go. The house still had her handwriting on the inside of the kitchen cabinet where she'd tracked Ivy's height every year until Ivy was 15 and announced she was done growing whether they measured her or not. Ivy was at the kitchen table with her laptop and a mug of something that had gone cold. "How was it?" she said. "Fine," Bernard said. He put his thermos in the dish rack. He unclipped his radio. He sat down in the chair across from her and put his hands flat on the table, which was a thing he did when he was tired in a way that was different from the ordinary tired of a long shift. Ivy looked at him. She had her mother's way of reading him, not asking exactly, but making the question available. "Someone dared me to sing," he said. She waited. "At the karaoke thing they had." "You sang?" she said, and her voice had the particular quality of someone who is not surprised but is adjusting to the confirmation. "Lightfoot," he said. She absorbed this. "Which one?" "Edmund Fitzgerald." Ivy was quiet for a moment. Then, "Dad, that song is 6.5 minutes long." "I know. In front of how many people?" 40, maybe 50. She looked at him for a long time. And nothing," he said. They clapped. She turned back to her laptop, then she closed it. "Did you tell anyone you'd sung in choir for like 40 years? "No. Did anyone ask?" He considered this. "No." She shook her head, not with frustration exactly, but with the specific exasperation of someone who knows a person well enough to know which parts of them will never change and has arrived at a complicated peace with that fact. "You know what the problem is?" she said. "Tell me. You've been that guy so long that you don't know people don't actually know who you are." He looked at her. "You think they see you," she said. "You think being there for 11 years means they know you. But they don't know you, Dad. They know the thermostat." He didn't answer right away. The refrigerator made its small, regular sound. Outside, a car passed on the street, its headlights sliding across the kitchen wall and then gone. "Louise used to say something like that," he said. "I know," Ivy said. "She told me." Louise Colhoun had been a music teacher at St. Catherine's Elementary for 22 years. She was the one who had kept Bernard singing after his own school years ended, who had pulled him back into the choir when life had repeatedly arranged itself in ways that made it easy to step back from things. She'd sat in the front pew at St. Andrew's every Wednesday evening rehearsal for 15 years with her own sheet music and her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She'd had opinions about breath control that she expressed freely and without apology. She'd been the one during the bad years when Bernard had been laid off from his previous job and the bills were the kind of problem that woke you at 3 in the morning, who had said, "You have to keep the music, not because it will fix anything, because it's yours." He'd kept the music. He just hadn't told anyone about it. It was not a secret, exactly. It was more that it had never come up in the context in which people knew him, and he hadn't thought to introduce it, and after enough time passed, the idea of introducing it felt stranger than leaving it alone. He sang in choir on Sundays. He drove his truck. He fixed the things in buildings that needed fixing. He ate his lunch by the utility sink and read library paperbacks. He went home and he and Ivy had dinner, and sometimes they watched something on the television, and sometimes they talked, and sometimes they were just in the same room, which was its own kind of company. That was his life. It was not a life that required anyone at Hartwell and Associates to know he could sing, except that now they knew. He found out how much they knew on the following Monday. He arrived at the building at 7:15, as he always did, and went down to the mechanical room to run his morning check of the systems. He had his thermos and his clipboard, and his boots left scuff marks on the marble the way they always did. Everything was normal for approximately 40 minutes, until he went up to the lobby to check the heating panels near the main entrance, and Jeffrey Adair, who apparently arrived at his office early on Mondays, stepped out of the elevator and saw him. Jeffrey Adair stopped. He stood there for a moment in the way of a man reorganizing his morning. "Bernard," he said. Bernard looked up from the panel. It was the first time in 11 years that Jeffrey Adair had used his name. Not his first name and not his last name, just Bernard complete, like a fact he'd had access to the whole time and had chosen now to deploy. "Morning," Bernard said. Jeffrey came a few steps toward him. He had the look of a man who has something he wants to say and is deciding how to say it without making it bigger than it needs to be. "Friday night," Jeffrey said. Bernard waited. "That was I wanted to say. I thought that was something." "Thank you," Bernard said. "I didn't know you sang. Not many people do." Jeffrey was quiet for a moment. Then, "My father was a musician. Amateur, I mean. He played piano for the church when I was a boy. I haven't thought about that in a long time." Bernard said nothing because the statement didn't require anything. "Anyway," Jeffrey said. "Good morning." "Good morning," Bernard said. Jeffrey went to his office. Bernard went back to the panel. He was not certain what to do with that information. He filed it in the same mental category where he kept other things that were true and not actionable. The sparrow that nested every spring in the gap above the loading dock door. The way the fourth-floor corridor smelled faintly of cedar from an office where someone kept a wood humidifier. The fact that the managing partner of Hartwell and Associates had a father who played piano in a church when he was a boy, and had not thought about it in a long time, and had thought about it on Friday night in the Marquette room. The building had more in it than people noticed. It always did. The thing that changed was not dramatic. Bernard would have been disappointed if it were. Drama, in his experience, was usually a sign that something had been avoided for too long. What changed was quieter than that, the particular difference between a room that knows you're in it and a room that doesn't. The receptionist on the 3rd floor, he learned her name was Keely Fontaine, stopped propping the fire door open and started simply texting him when she needed something instead. He hadn't given her his number. She'd asked Don Veitch for it. Don Veitch had apparently given it to her without comment, which Bernard considered a form of communication from Don. The junior associate from the loading dock, his name was Andrew Seto, stopped him one morning near the service elevator and said, simply, "Lightfoot's a good choice." Then he got on the elevator and that was it. No elaboration. Bernard had respected that. Spencer Okafor had said nothing to him directly. But Spencer, Bernard noticed, no longer positioned himself in front of the service corridor doorway when he was on his phone calls, which he used to do because the signal was better there, and because, Bernard suspected, he had never considered that the doorway belonged to anyone. It was a small thing. Bernard noticed it. He mentioned none of this to Ivy until a Thursday evening in late January, When they were eating dinner, she'd made pasta, which was one of about 4 things she made with confidence, and she asked, without preamble, how things were going at the building. "Different," he said. "Different how?" He thought about it. "People know my name." Ivy put down her fork. She looked at him with the expression she'd been refining since she was about 8 years old. Not surprised, not smug, not sentimental. Just present. "Was that the point," she said, "of singing?" "No," he said. "I sang because he dared me and I wasn't going to let him decide what I could do." She nodded slowly. But still, he said. She picked up her fork again. "Louise would have had something to say about that," she said, which was not exactly right, because what Louise would have had was a specific look, slightly raised eyebrow, the corner of her mouth a fraction upward, that communicated "I told you" without requiring words. "She would have," Bernard agreed. Outside, the January wind was doing what January wind in Ontario does, which is nothing gentle. The kitchen was warm. The refrigerator made it sound. Bernard finished his pasta, and Ivy closed her laptop, and for a while they sat at the table after dinner, the way they had been sitting at the table after dinner for 3 years now. Comfortable in the specific way of two people who understand that shared silence is not the absence of something, but the presence of something else. He was still the man who fixed the boiler. He would be there tomorrow at 7:15 with his thermos and his clipboard, checking the systems the way he always had, leaving before most people arrived, noticed by the buildings and not by the people inside them. That was fine. He knew who he was. He'd known for a long time. The only difference now was that 40 people in a room on a Friday night in December knew it too. And one of them had a father who used to play piano in a church, and one of them had pressed her hand flat against her chest without knowing why. And one of them had stood near the bar with his drink raised and found, for 6.5 minutes, that he had nothing left to say. Bernard Colquhoun drove home the way he always did, through streets that were ordinary and lit in his, and the truck's heater ran a little loud the way it always did in cold weather, and the cracked mirror on the left side caught the lights behind him in a way that was slightly fractured, slightly double, not quite right but close enough, and he thought that he should probably get that fixed. He thought he probably wouldn't.